Welcome to episode 11 in our series on Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's The Way of God. And we are still in the section of Providence, the second section, and we're up to chapter 5. And chapter 5 is entitled How Providence Works. And, just to recap, the first 4 chapters of this Providence section have basically dealt with the consequences of God's providence and what they are based on. For example, rewards or suffering or just one's role in life. So in this chapter and the next following few chapters, the Ramchal will discuss how God interacts with the world through his providence. Also, the fact that he describes the kind of all-seeing eye of God. I think in Pirkei Avos it's quoted as there's an eye that sees everything, an ear that hears everything, and everything, every deed and misdeed is recorded. So Ramchal is going to describe how Hashem sees everything and notes everything. And it's going to talk about this idea of this energy, this animating kind of electricity throughout the world, this shefa, and how God distributes it throughout reality, and how it's kind of siphoned down from the ultimate source. So let's begin with chapter 5, How Providence Works. So Ramchal begins. Until now, we have been discussing the rules of providence. We will now discuss how it works. In general, when we speak of God's providence, we are discussing 2 things. One involves God's perception, and the other his influence. With regard to God's perception, we are already aware that he knows everything. It is absolutely impossible that he be ignorant of anything, either in the past, present, or future. Everything that was or will be was foreseen by God from the beginning of time, and nothing was hidden from him. Everything that exists is revealed and known to him, and in its every aspect. Absolutely nothing is concealed from God, and his knowledge is not bound by time. We say that God scrutinizes things, however, when he judges or issues a decree regarding them. This is then bounded by the time during which he wishes to act upon these things. This concept will be discussed further in the next chapter. So it's a very hard thing to get your mind around. The fact that God is watching everything. Perhaps as a human being you may think, if he's watching me, perhaps he's not watching my neighbour. But if he's watching my neighbour, perhaps he's not watching me. And perhaps you think you can hide from God. But when you try to hide from God, from God's light, you kind of find yourself in very shady places, and to your detriment. So once you accept the fact that there is an all-powerful being who is actually monitoring all your thoughts, analyzes how you think about things, looks at your intentions, and creates the best path for you, whether it be reward or rectification. It's something very important to understand. But when if you're doing something bad, you should be aware of that God is watching you. But if you're also doing something good, like you're learning, you should also comfort yourself with the fact that God is watching you learn. Every word out of the Gemara that you're learning, for example, God is sitting alongside you and listening to you learn. So the Ramchal continues now with this divine influence which puts judgments and decrees into action. This is not just the observation of a human being by God. This is how he puts events into action. So the Ramchal continues. When we speak of God's influence, we are speaking of the system and order that he desired to make use of in translating his will into action. God arranged all created things in a system of steps and sequences, this being the system that he desired, just as he desired that his sequence exist in the nature of things. He likewise willed that it exist in their maintenance and function. Through this system, all details of existence are sustained and influenced by God as he desires. This is true of every process and relationship. God thus first influences an angel, who in turn influences another angel on a lower level. This continues step by step until the final angel acts upon a physical thing. This can either sustain a thing or bring about something new, all according to the decree ultimately emanating from God. The sustenance of everything that exists on every level, however, ultimately emanates only from God. It is God's power that sustains all created things as well as their order, each one in its particular aspect. Things that occur in the physical world, however, must be brought about through the system of entities and their relationships discussed earlier. This in turn must follow the sequence that we have mentioned. So just to pause there and perhaps give a little bit of insight into this concept. We say before the Shema and Shacharis a number of passages that deal with the Ofanim and Seraphim and Chayat HaKodesh. These are all the emanations from God. These are all the channels that siphon down this pure shefa, this energy. Perhaps a good analogy I heard was, let's say you say reality is like it is in real life. For example, you're trying to power up your laptop. It wouldn't make sense to take your laptop to the energy power plant and plug it straight into the powerful conductor. What you would do is the conductor electricity is siphoned down to lower and lower voltages until it reaches your abode, your house, your flat, and you have a plug in the wall that you're able to siphon this very same pure energy, but in a much, much diluted way. So this is the series from the power plant down through the power lines, through the distribution networks and centers, through to your local electricity siphoning area, and then through to your home. That's the kind of chain that has to be built in order to siphon down God's pure energy, this shefa that is being discussed. And it's done through invisible forces that are called angels, that are called perhaps seraphim, ofanim, and chayat hakodesh, these sort of concepts. So the Ramchal is going to describe these agents of providence who perform these specialized functions. So the Ramchal continues. God created a directing angel over everything that exists in the physical world. He likewise gave each of these angels such a nature that it should remain at its post and sustain what is placed under its hand. It cannot be removed from its post except through the system set up by God. Thus, for example, there is a directing angel associated with trees, and its task is to strive to sustain these trees. When a decree is issued by God, however, the directing angel of the wind may be strengthened to the extent required by this decree. The angel of trees can then be pushed aside, and some of his trees torn up by the wind. Within this general concept, however, there are many levels and details. There are angels assigned to oversee the laws of nature and strengthen the various aspects and processes of the physical world. Above them are the angels involved in carrying out decrees concerning reward and punishment, and according to such decrees, these can prevent the angels of nature from functioning. All this involves many details, according to God's unfathomable hidden ways. God himself oversees all things, above and below, roots and branches. He constantly takes into account the ultimate general perfection, and all creation revolves around this point. The general concept then affects each individual according to his particular readiness. On the basis of this, it is decided whether he should be drawn close to God or cast away, and whether he be purified by suffering or left alone. Every individual is dealt with according to what he deserves, in such a manner as to advance the perfection of creation as a whole. When he wills, God can change the order of creation at any time. He can bring about various miracles and wonders as he desires and deems beneficial for creation, according to the time and circumstances. This might seem to contradict what our sages teach us when they say, in cases where miracles occurred, and I quote, God made specific conditions with all of creation. This statement, however, does not mean that in cases where God did not make such conditions, he can no longer change things. This is not the case, for God can definitely change things as completely as he wishes at any time he pleases. What our sages are teaching us is that at the time of creation, God showed and informed the roots of all created things of their true essence and nature, as well as the purpose for which they were created. He furthermore showed these roots everything that they were destined to bring about throughout history, as well as their ultimate destiny. They realized and knew that everything was directed towards a genuinely good purpose, and therefore rejoiced and were satisfied. This is what our sages meant when they also taught us everything in creation was first asked if it wanted to be created and agreed. When God informed these roots of their concept, nature and ultimate effects, he also showed them that their fulfillment would require them to be involved in miracles at specific times. These might be for the sake of the Jews as a whole, or for their particular righteous individuals. All this concerns the highest roots, and following all this, the necessary sequence was then set in motion. Everything appropriate to these roots was placed in the physical world, and directing angels were set over these things to sustain them according to the laws of nature. Then, when God willed it, it was decreed that these directing angels should suspend their function, and that the natural order be changed according to that degree. A decree can be issued in many different ways. Thus, for example, it can be issued like a royal order, or in a manner of the tirade of an angry tyrant. We find an example of the latter with respect to the splitting of the Red Sea, as it is written in Tehillim 106 verse 9. God raged at the Red Sea, and it became dry land. All this likewise depends on the time and circumstances. So that concludes the 5th chapter of how providence works. So, just to recap, we are given an idea of the all-seeing eye of God, that everything that we do at all times is monitored completely by God. It's a very strange concept to know that God is watching you 100% of the time, and you think that attention must be shared somehow if one is looking at two things, but God is beyond our capabilities, and he watches everything and everyone 100% of the time. It's a very hard concept to get your head around, because you think that if someone is watching from above, that at some point they're not watching you, but that's not the case. Otherwise God wouldn't be able to consider how your providence would be meted, unless it was absolutely 100% of the time observing you. And later in this chapter, it describes how this chain of diffusion of shefa, of energy, happens from God through various channels. But the channels that the angels that pass on this shefa, or this animating energy, have no free will of their own, or cannot decide not to do that. They are built and they are ready to fulfill God's mission, and they do it to 100% degree. It's like a It's also described like God distributes, like at a government, God would distribute money to various ministries and instruct them how to spend this budget exactly down to the penny. And there was no corruption within this chain of commands. So that's also another way to describe how this shefa, or animating energy, for events and people and life is distributed. So, in the next episode, we're up to chapter 6, which deals with this system of providence.